Hello and welcome back to Fuck That. If you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe so that way you never miss an episode. Also, if you listen to this pod and you like it, it would really mean a lot if you could leave the podcast a review. Actually, you don't even have to review it. You could just give me 5 stars. Or 1 if you feel so inclined. All right, today we're headed back to the summer of 1969, a year after RFK's assassination. Just as the Kennedy dynasty was kind of teetering between American royalty or full-blown Greek tragedy. The setting for the story today? A little bridge on a tiny island off of Martha's Vineyard. A car, a young woman, and a story that has haunted United States politics for over 50 years, even if the people involved spent every second trying to bury it. This is the story of Chappaquiddick, or, as I like to call it, how to kill your presidential dreams by driving off a bridge and not telling anyone for 10 fucking hours. Let's back up. Before we get to the part where a woman dies in a submerged car while a Kennedy played dumb for several hours, let's talk about the man who put her there and how the hell he got to be a United States Senator in the first place. Edward Kennedy Moore, aka Ted, was born February 22, 1932 in Boston, Massachusetts, the 9th and youngest child in a family that practically viewed public office as a birthright. His parents, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, were already deeply entrenched in wealth, politics, and Catholic guilt. Joe Sr. was a ruthless businessman and former ambassador to the UK, who really wanted a son in the White House like it was some kind of familial business acquisition. Rose was the mayor of Boston's daughter, basically Catholic royalty. So Ted, he wasn't born into expectations, he was engineered for them. And just to give an overview of the Kennedy children, we had Joseph Jr., John, Jack Kennedy, our former president, Rose Marie, who went by Rosemary, who the family had lobotomized, Kathleen Kick, Eunice, Patricia, Robert, RFK Jr.'s dad, Jean, and Edward, the subject of this episode. Ted grew up bouncing between their Boston mansion and their Palm Beach estate. If that sounds familiar to you, you get a cookie because it is the same estate that I talked about in the last episode. The same estate where William Kennedy Smith, who was in the company of Senator Ted Kennedy, sexually assaulted the victim. So they're just really enmeshed in some fucked up shit with each other. We'll just leave it at that. So he bounced between their Boston mansion, Palm Beach, and his childhood was shaped by power, appearances, and private schools. He went to Milton Academy, where he was a very mediocre student but a decent athlete. But let's be honest, he was a Kennedy. You don't have to be good at school or anything if you're a Kennedy. In 1950, he enrolled at Harvard University and promptly got expelled during his sophomore year for cheating on a Spanish exam. As in, he paid another student to take it for him, and that student also got booted out of Harvard. But technically for Ted, Harvard really just suspended him, which sounds bad until you realize they also let him come back 2 years later like it was a timeout and not academic fraud. So in 1951, at 19, Ted decided to enlist into the Army in a dare to be different from his 3 brothers that decided to join the Navy. He was only gone long enough to complete a 2-year Army stint, stationed in Europe, not because he was gung-ho to serve, but because the alternative was getting publicly roasted. And what's funny about this story is Ted actually did not read his enlistment paperwork, so he signed on for 4 years, which he didn't want. He realized what he did. He cried to Daddy about it, and Ambassador Kennedy fixed it for him. So he only had to do 2 years. Read the fine print, people. Read the terms of service. Next time you get an iPhone update, read that shit. Who knows what you're signing up for? So Teddy Boy goes back to Harvard. And then after Harvard, he got his law degree from the University of Virginia in 1959. He was ranked 151st out of 156 students in his class. Yes, really. UVA would later call him a C student with strong family connections, which is probably the most polite way to say legacy admit with the GPA of a desk lamp. What's interesting about his time at UVA, while he was a second-year law student, he was caught going 90 miles an hour, which he then decided to run a stoplight and turn off his lights in an effort to get away from Deputy Sheriff Tom Whitten. He was eventually caught slumped down in his seat in an effort to try to not be seen, I guess. If I can't see you, you can't see me. He was seen. And he was charged with reckless driving, racing with an officer to avoid arrest, operating a motor vehicle without an operator's license. Ted tried to postpone many times, but he eventually answered the summons and paid $35 in fines. He was also ticketed another time at UVA for speeding. After barely scraping through law school and somehow passing the bar in Massachusetts, Ted married Joan Bennett, who he met in college, and then landed a job as an assistant district attorney in Suffolk County in 1961, just a few short weeks after his brother, John F. Kennedy, was sworn in as President of the United States. Ted wasn't hired for his legal skills. He was hired because his last name was Kennedy and someone needed to give the kid something to do. This really reflected in his time with Suffolk County. He handled mostly routine cases, low-level offenses, nothing really high stakes, but he tried to avoid taking cases whenever he could. No major trials, no legal victories anybody would remember. He was also known to show up to court unprepared. But thankfully for Ted, he was known to sway a jury, especially if there were women on it, which to me is way more dangerous and scary than impressive. Because what the fuck? According to multiple accounts of former coworkers, he was disengaged, inconsistent, and more interested in networking than doing the actual job. He put in the hours, sure, but it was clear from the jump that this was just a pit stop on the way to a bigger, better political ambition, a placeholder gig, one that made it look like he earned something when in reality he had not. Ted didn't leave with glowing recommendations. He left with a very forgettable record and a last name that could unfortunately still open any door that mattered because Kennedy. And it's at this point where the Kennedy machine really kicks into fucking gear. Are you ready? Because it's nepotism and political manipulation at its finest. But I guess I find comfort in the fact that this kind of bullshit has always happened in the United States. All right, here we go. Let's talk about it. When JFK ran for president in 1960, this meant he had to give up his U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts. Rather than risk some outsider winning that seat and screwing up the family legacy, Joe Sr. and JFK orchestrated one of the most brazen acts of political nepotism in modern history. JFK tapped Benjamin Smith II, his college roommate and Gloucester mayor, to serve as a placeholder, literally to sit in the Senate and do nothing for 2 years while Ted waited to turn 30, the minimum legal age to run. Let that sink in. They installed a human bookmark in the U.S. Senate just to keep Ted's seat warm, and nobody stopped them. So for those of you rightfully pissed off with the political state of the United States, just know politicians have been pulling this absolutely insane bullshit for a very long time. Abolish career politicians. Anyways. So in 1962, Ted finally ran for that seat, the one that JFK vacated, the one that Ben Smith babysat. He had money, name recognition, but zero meaningful qualifications. What's even more fucked up about this is JFK publicly announced that he was staying out of the election in Massachusetts, but unbeknownst to the public, he provided his younger brother with a shit ton of help. Pressures were imposed onto Massachusetts Democrats, and it was made painfully aware that they would have to deal with the Kennedys for years to come. This is why I hate politics. JFK also sent several White House employees to Massachusetts to assist with various things, such as speech preparation, but Ted was still not a great public speaker. He ended up running against Eddie McCormack for the Democratic seat. Won. Then he faced Republican George Lodge. Edward's grandfather, Honey Fritz, lost the same Senate seat to George's great-grandfather in 1916, Henry Cabot Lodge, so this became known as the Battle of the Dynasties. Courtesy of his last name and the fact that Massachusetts voters basically treated the Kennedy family like royalty, he won. And just like that, Ted Kennedy became a United States Senator. Early on, his legislative record was thin. He leaned heavily on his last name and family advisors to guide him. Behind closed doors, he was widely viewed as the least intellectually serious of the Kennedy brothers. Ted would show up, make mediocre speeches, vote the party line, and collect goodwill that had been earned by his brothers, but not by him. On November 22nd, 1963, Senator Kennedy was covering for the vice president, presiding over a debate on a bill about library services. A press aide ran to the floor and handed a note to Senator Holland of Florida, who then whispered to Senator Kennedy, "The president has just been shot." After his brother's death, it was obvious that as Kennedy returned to Massachusetts to ask for a 6-year Senate term, he would win in the wake of his brother's assassination. But unfortunately for Ted, there would be another disaster that would solidify that even further. Ted was taking a flight to Springfield, Massachusetts to accept the Democratic Convention's nomination for Massachusetts, and the plane he was in lost control in heavy fog, and it crashed into an orchard about 7 miles away from the destination. Kennedy survived, but the pilot and his aide did not survive. And in the crash, Kennedy broke his back, 3 ribs, and had a collapsed lung. Initially, doctors thought that he may be paralyzed for the rest of his life, but luckily he recovered. Kennedy was reelected, and he immediately got to work. By 1969, he was on his 2nd term in the Senate, just 1 year out from Bobby's assassination. The torch wasn't just being passed, it was being shoved into his hands, whether he was ready for it or not. In spite of the polished image and the perfectly tailored suits, Ted Kennedy had one habit that never got cleaned up by campaign staff. He was a reckless, entitled asshole behind the wheel of a car. Edgartown was a small town on the eastern side of Martha's Vineyard. Cute, coastal, and crawling with money. Year-round, the population was around 1,500 people, but in the summer, that number easily quadrupled. Everybody with a boat and a trust fund came flooding to show off. The police force, just 5 people, normally maybe 10 in the summer if they were lucky. And at the time of the incident, Chief Jim Dominic was short-staffed and struggling to keep up. Rich people caused more problems than 5 board officers could handle. So the week of July 13th, 1969 started off like any other sleepy summer week. But Edgartown was gearing up for a big tradition, the regatta. I know, sounds like something out of Friends. The only time I've ever heard that word was when Rachel was talking about the regatta gala. But this was the 46th annual regatta, and it was a big deal for people who wore sweaters over their shoulders like sociopaths. According to the Vineyard Gazette, this was the largest entry ever. Yachts, sailboats, booze, and most importantly, the Kennedys. The family had been sailing in the regatta for over 30 years because, of course, they had. Thursday, July 17th, the town was buzzing. Rich Chads were ironing their pastel shorts. Women were glamming up for yacht selfies. Just kidding, there were no cell phones back then. And every bar in town had at least one guy bragging about his sailing experience like it was combat service. The Kennedys had a reputation in this town, old money, democratic royalty. But Edgartown was conservative, so anytime one of the Kennedy boys got caught doing something stupid, which was often, it became local lore. Gossip swirled around about their drinking, partying, and just general frat boy energy. Sorry for party rocking, I guess. On Friday the 18th, not long after the regatta kicked off, a man believed to be Ted Kennedy was seen stepping out of a vehicle onto the ferry that crossed from Edgartown to Chappaquiddick. A quick geography lesson. Chappaquiddick is not some remote deserted island. It's a skinny stretch of land across the channel from Edgartown. Less than 7 square miles total, covered in dirt roads, thick brush, and sand dunes. The only way over? A tiny-ass ferry that carried 3 cars at a time and made the crossing in under a minute. People with money, like Kennedy-level money, would just keep 1 car on each side. Of course they did. Actually, I lied. There's one other way to get across, and we're going to talk about how that is and who did it. So Ted was seen on the other side with a paper cup in hand, sipping something allegedly before dumping it on the ground and getting into a black Oldsmobile on the Chappaquiddick side. This was around 1 p.m. Nobody saw him again for about an hour. Then, around 3, he was spotted on Victoria, a 1932 15-foot-long Wieno senior sailboat that he inherited from his brother John. Because why wouldn't you sail a family heirloom during a regatta in a town that worships your last name? Later that afternoon, he was seen again on the Bonnie Lisa, the winning yacht of the regatta, before heading back to shore and making his way to the Mayberry house, the cottage he rented for the weekend. And this is where things really start to set the scene. Instead of staying at the usual Kennedy compound, Ted had rented this cottage on Chappaquiddick, supposedly for privacy, because nothing screams privacy like renting a cottage across a narrow body of water with a guest list full of political insiders, I guess. The cottage was owned by Lawrence and Mary Steenhuisen, and it was tucked down a really long dirt road surrounded by pitch black brush, no lights, no pavement, and one single road leading out. This weekend was thrown together by Ted, and it was pitched as a reunion in honor of RFK and his campaign team, specifically the Boiler Room Girls, and they were former staffers of RFK during his 1968 presidential campaign. The Boiler Room Girls got their nickname from the cramped basement room in D.C. where they worked during the campaign. But don't let the name fool you. They weren't secretaries or interns. These women ran the engine of RFK's operation. They tracked delegate counts, handled press strategy, dug through opposition research, coordinated state primaries, all while being wildly underpaid and mostly uncredited, of course. But they were truly the nerve center of Bobby's campaign. And when Bobby was assassinated in June of 1968, these women didn't just lose their jobs. They lost the only political world where they'd been allowed to operate with any real agency. So when Ted and his cousin Joe Gargan invited them out to Chappaquiddick a year later, it was pitched as something comforting, a low-key, nostalgic weekend where people could reconnect, grieve maybe, reflect, and, I don't know, maybe see if Ted could slide into Bobby's shoes without anybody looking too closely. One of those women was Mary Jo Kopechne. Mary Jo was 28 years old, Catholic, soft-spoken, and sharp as hell. She was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, raised in Berwick, and the only child of a working-class family. She went to college in 1962 and earned a degree in business education. She taught school for a bit before going full tilt into politics, first with Senator George Smathers, then joining RFK's campaign. Mary Jo worked as a speechwriter and handled high-level correspondence. She wasn't there to get drinks for the team or sit quietly in the corner. She was trusted with crafting Bobby's words, and in an era where women were usually kept far from the front lines of politics, she was right there in the trenches. After Bobby's death, she moved to D.C. and took a job at Matt Reese Associates, which was a political consulting firm, and tried to keep going. But people close to her said that she was still grieving. And when the invite to Chappaquiddick came, she hesitated. It really wasn't her scene anymore. She didn't drink much. She wasn't big on parties, but she agreed to go because when a United States senator and the brother of the man you worked for, cried for, and believed in asks you to come to a small gathering in his honor, you just show up. Now Mary Jo is in that cottage that night with 5 other women and 6 men, all of them tied to Bobby's memory, all of them orbiting Ted. The last Kennedy standing, if you will, like he was the future. Everybody probably thought that he was safe, and Mary Jo assumed that she'd be home that night. The men at the party were Kennedy staffers, cousins, and hangers-on, and just so we're clear, no spouses were invited. Let that sink in. The drinking started early, beer, scotch, rum and cokes, and nobody was exactly doing inventory of how much alcohol was there and how much was being consumed and by whom. Some people said Ted had 1 or 2 drinks, others say he was visibly buzzed, but conveniently, nobody really nailed down just how drunk anybody was, almost like they didn't want to destroy the career of a sitting senator. Mary Jo was not throwing back drinks like the rest. She told a few friends she was planning to head back to her hotel that night, even had her bag and key with her. Around 11:15 p.m. that evening, Ted told the group he was going to drive Mary Jo to catch the last ferry, which sounds generous until you remember that the ferry stopped running at midnight and had for decades. This wasn't really new information. Ted Kennedy practically grew up on this island, and he knew how the schedule worked. But here's the part that doesn't add up. They had time. It takes maybe 10 minutes max to get from the cottage to the ferry landing. So why didn't they make it? Why didn't anybody see them there? Why didn't the ferry operator, who testified that he never saw Kennedy or Mary Jo that night, mention anything? Because they didn't go to the ferry. Kennedy, who was driving a 1967 Oldsmobile Delmont 88 at the time, and for reasons he never fully explained, instead of taking the one paved road toward the ferry slip, he made a sharp turn onto Dyke Road, an unlit, narrow dirt road with no streetlights, no signs, and nothing at the end except a wooden bridge, one-lane wooden bridge. And underneath that bridge was a tidal pond. So this isn't the kind of road that you end up on by accident unless you're unfamiliar with the area. And that's the catch. Many people claim that Ted knew the island well, that the Kennedys had summered there for years and he'd driven those roads dozens of times. Others argue that while he knew the main roads, the back roads of Chappaquiddick weren't his usual territory. It's not a huge island, but it is easy to get turned around in the dark, especially if you've been drinking. But that brings us to this bridge. Dyke Bridge was infamous. People in the area had actually been complaining about it for years, but nothing ever got done. Underneath the bridge was Pocha Pond, a tidal pond that connects to the ocean, which means it can sometimes have strong currents, and it also changes depth with the tide. At high tide, it could be 8 to 10 feet deep. The mean depth of the pond is 2.5 feet. The visibility is shit at night, and when you add in silt and brackish water, it can make it a bit of a nightmare. Unfortunately, with this story, we don't know what happened. We know that there was a car accident, which we'll get into, and we know some of the events that followed. But the only two people who could really say what happened is Mary Jo, who passed away in the accident, and Ted Kennedy, who's a lying politician. According to Deputy Look, yes, that was his actual name, around 12:40 a.m., so well over an hour after they left the cottage, and again, they're on a very small island, he saw a black Oldsmobile kicking up sand as it sped down Dyke Road. Approximately 10 minutes later, that same car plunged off of the bridge into the pond. It flipped and landed upside down in the water. Kennedy somehow escaped, soaking wet, disoriented, but alive. Mary Jo was still inside, trapped. This is where it goes from suspicious to infuriating, because Ted did not call for help. He passed several houses, all with working phones, all within shouting distance. And instead of banging on doors or screaming for somebody to call the cops, he just kept walking. Eventually, he made it back to the cottage, found his cousin Joe and his friend Paul Markham, both lawyers, and he told them what happened. For some reason, alcohol. Ted didn't want to call police. He was drunk. So he told them that the car went off the bridge, Mary Jo was still in the water, he didn't remember how he got out, and instead of any one of those three men calling the cops, they go back to the scene, and both Joe and Paul dove in to try to rescue her, but came up empty. And still, nobody calls the police. Nobody calls for help. Kennedy just stood there repeating, "What do we do?" over and over, like a guy managing public relations, not a guy who just left an abandoned woman trapped in a car underwater. But it gets worse. He then did something that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. Kennedy could not rescue Mary Jo from the water because the current was too strong. But he walked to the edge of the channel that separated Chappaquiddick and Edgartown, and he swam across 500 feet of open water back to Edgartown at night, in the same tidal current that killed Mary Jo. He went back to his hotel, spoke briefly with the front desk, and went to bed. Around 2:30 a.m., he called to ask what time it was, almost like he was trying to leave a trail. Meanwhile, Mary Jo was still in the car, still underwater, and when diver John Farrer pulled her body out the next morning, she wasn't slumped over like somebody who died on impact. She was curled up in the footwell, hands gripping the back seat. Farrer said she probably found an air pocket and survived for up to an hour. If somebody had called for help immediately, he thinks that he could have saved her, but nobody did. It wasn't until 8 a.m. the following morning when two fishermen saw the car's wheels sticking out of the water that police were called, and that's when they made the dive, and they recovered Mary Jo's body. Inside the car, on the front seat, was a black purse, but it wasn't hers. It belonged to Rosemary Cricket Keough, another guest at the party. And that little detail unraveled everything, because if the purse didn't match the victim, then who had been in the car? And why did Kennedy wait until 9:50 in the morning, over 10 hours later, to stroll into the Edgartown police station and report it? So it took a little bit of time for police to realize who it was because of the purse. By the time Teddy Boy waltzed into the police station at 9:50 in the morning, Mary Jo's body had already been pulled from the car. The fisherman who found the car had called it in about an hour earlier, and Ted, he looked clean, calm, and very prepared, like a man who had spent the morning crafting a story with lawyers and not spiraling over what he'd done. His statement was short, vague, and full of holes. He said he was driving Mary Jo to catch the ferry. He said he took a wrong turn. He said he was in shock. He said he tried to save her, and then, only once he fully realized what had happened this morning, he reported it to police. Sure, Jan. Let's be real, nobody believed that timeline, including the cops, but this was Edgartown, a summer town with a 5-person police force that barely handled bar fights, let alone a dead woman connected to the most powerful family in America. The chief had no experience with this kind of thing, and honestly, it showed. Instead of arresting Kennedy on the spot, they let him leave. No cuffs, no holding cell, no immediate questioning. He wasn't even brought to the station until he chose to walk in hours later. There was no breathalyzer, although that probably wouldn't have really yielded any results that long after. No blood test, nothing that could prove whether he was drunk when the crash happened, even though every single witness had seen him drinking hours earlier. The investigation was not even an investigation. There was no autopsy, nobody would allow for a toxicology test, and her body was quickly moved out of the state. A young woman was found dead in a car registered to a U.S. senator who waited 10 hours to report it, and somehow the coroner never performed a full autopsy. The medical examiner ruled it an accidental drowning based on the circumstances, and that was that. Mary Jo's parents were never given a complete explanation. They were told it was a tragic accident, that Ted did everything he could, that nothing more could have possibly been done. By the time the public found out about the crash, the Kennedy machine was already in full-on damage control. Ted's lawyers, aides, and media people worked fast because they had to. There was no version of this story that made him look good. A woman was dead, and the only reason anyone even knew about it was because 2 guys fishing stumbled onto the scene. Meanwhile, Ted was fucking gone. After dropping his typed-up "I was disoriented and tired" statement at the station, he did not stick around. He went back to Hyannisport, hid out with his lawyers, and left the town of Edgartown to clean up the fallout. Mary Jo's funeral was held very quietly in Pennsylvania. Ted didn't speak, he didn't even attend. He showed up at the cemetery in secret, dropped off flowers, and dipped, because even in death, Mary Jo wasn't the center of this story. Ted was. So how did they spin it? They leaned on sympathy, on trauma. They turned a fatal crash and 10-hour delay into a confused, exhausted, poor man in shock. Reporters were fed a very sanitized timeline. They were told Ted was disoriented, maybe confused, that he tried his best. They even floated the idea that he might have had a medical episode, because nothing says cardiac event like running from the scene and swimming across a channel to your fucking hotel room. Please, be so fucking for real. And then came a legal move. Not one that you're going to be happy about. Ted was charged with leaving the scene of an accident causing personal injury. A misdemeanor. Not manslaughter, not negligent homicide, just leaving, like the issue wasn't the fact that a woman died trapped in a car alone. There was no grand jury indictment, no real investigation into how drunk he was, no autopsy to prove whether she died instantly or suffocated slowly, even though from the diver's testimony we can surmise that she found an air pocket and likely survived. All of that was shut down or brushed aside under the guise of respecting the family's wishes, which conveniently also protected the only Kennedy left with political potential. Funny how that works. On July 25th, a full week after Mary Jo died, Ted pled guilty. The judge gave him a suspended 2-month sentence. No jail time, no fine, no accountability. So he walked out of that courtroom the same way he walked away from the crash, untouched. The judge said that he had been through enough. He did have his driver's license suspended for 16 months, but let's be real, Ted Kennedy didn't need to drive himself anywhere. He had aides, chauffeurs, a literal Senate staff. So that punishment was basically just for optics. So just to recap, Mary Jo was left to die alone in a car underwater, and the man responsible got a suspended sentence and a suspended license. If this name had been anything other than Kennedy, we'd be telling a very different story. This is a tale as old as time. Just to really twist the knife, because this isn't enough at this point, Ted Kennedy went on television. Not just a press conference, a full, pre-recorded, primetime address to the American public on July 25th of 1969. He looked solemn, devastated, talked about his Catholic guilt. No, I'm not kidding. Said he wasn't sure if some awful curse hung over the Kennedys. He took full responsibility while denying most of the actual facts, and then with a straight face, he asked the people of Massachusetts to decide whether he should stay in office. Spoiler alert, they said yes. Mary Jo's life ended in a pond on Chappaquiddick Island. Ted Kennedy's career didn't even hit a fucking speed bump, and that says everything about the system that protected him. Ted's apology has been dissected and analyzed by many critics because it does not adequately address his actions during the incident, although he did accept blame. I thought about whether or not I should read it because the transcript is available, but I think it would be helpful to hear it, so pretend I am a United States Senator who just took a woman's life. My fellow citizens, I have requested this opportunity to talk to the people of Massachusetts about the tragedy which happened last Friday evening. This morning, I entered a plea of guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident. Prior to my appearance in court, it would have been improper for me to comment on these matters. But tonight, I'm free to tell you what happened and to say what it means to me. On the weekend of July 18th, I was on Martha's Vineyard Island participating with my nephew, Joe Kennedy, as for 30 years my family has participated in the annual Edgartown Sailing Regatta. Only reasons of health prevented my wife from accompanying me. On Chappaquiddick Island, off Martha's Vineyard, I attended, on Friday evening, July 18th, a cookout I had encouraged and helped sponsor for a devoted group of Kennedy campaign secretaries. When I left the party around 11:15 p.m., I was accompanied by one of these girls, Miss Mary Jo Kopechne. Mary Jo was one of the most devoted members of the staff of Senator Robert Kennedy. She worked for him for 4 years and was broken up over his death. For this reason, and because she was such a gentle, kind, and idealistic person, all of us tried to help her feel that she still had a home with the Kennedy family. There is no truth whatever, to the widely circulated suspicions of immoral conduct that have been leveled at my behavior and hers regarding that evening. There has never been a private relationship between us of any kind. I know of nothing in Mary Jo's conduct on that or any other occasion, and the same is true of the other girls at that party that would lend any substance to such ugly speculation about their character. Nor was I driving under the influence of liquor. Little over 1 mile away, the car that I was driving on an unlit road went off a narrow bridge which had no guardrails and was built on a left angle to the road. The car overturned in a deep pond and immediately filled with water. I remember thinking as the cold water rushed in and around my head that I was certain for drowning. Then water entered my lungs and I actually felt the sensation of drowning. But somehow I struggled to the surface alive. I made immediate and repeated efforts to save Mary Jo by diving into the strong and murky current, but succeeded only in increasing my state of utter exhaustion and alarm. My conduct and conversations during the next several hours, to the extent that I can remember them, make no sense to me at all. Although my doctors informed me that I suffered a cerebral concussion as well as shock, I do not seek to escape responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical and emotional trauma brought on by the accident or anyone else. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately. Instead of looking directly for a telephone after lying exhausted in the grass for an undetermined time, I walked back to the cottage where the party was being held and requested the help of my 2 friends, my cousin, Joseph Gargan, and Phil Markham, and directed them to return immediately to the scene with me. this was sometime after midnight, in order to undertake a new effort to dive down and locate Miss Kopechne. Their strenuous efforts, undertaken at some risk of their own lives, also proved futile. All kinds of scrambled thoughts, all of them confused, some of them irrational, many of them which I cannot recall, and some of which I would not have seriously entertained under normal circumstances, went through my mind during this period. They were reflected in the various inexplicable, inconsistent, and inconclusive things I said and did, including such questions as whether the girl might still be alive somewhere out of that immediate area, whether some awful curse did actually hang over all the Kennedys, whether there was some justifiable reason for me to doubt what had happened and to delay my report, whether somehow the awful weight of this incredible incident might in some way pass from my shoulders. I was overcome, I'm frank to say, by a jumble of emotions: grief, fear, doubt, exhaustion, panic, confusion, and shock. Instructing Gargan and Markham not to alarm Mary Jo's friends that night, I had them take me to the ferry crossing. The ferry having shut down for the night, I suddenly jumped into the water and impulsively swam across, nearly drowning once again in the effort, and returned to my hotel about 2 a.m., and collapsed in my room. I remember going out at one point and saying something to the room clerk. In the morning, with my mind somewhat more lucid, I made an effort to call a family legal advisor, Burke Marshall, from a public telephone on the Chappaquiddick side of the ferry, and then belatedly reported the accident to the Martha's Vineyard police. Today, as I mentioned, I felt morally obligated to plead guilty to the charge of leaving the scene of an accident. No words on my part can possibly express the terrible pain and suffering I feel over this tragic incident. This last week has been an agonizing one for me and for members of my family, and the grief we feel over the loss of a wonderful friend will remain with us for the rest of our lives. These events, the publicity, innuendo, and whispers which have surrounded them and my admission of guilt this morning, raises the question in my mind of whether my standing among the people of my state has been so impaired that I should resign my seat in the United States Senate. If at any time the citizens of Massachusetts should lack confidence in their senator's character or his ability, with or without justification, he could not, in my opinion, adequately perform his duties and should not continue in office. The people of this state, the state which sent John Quincy Adams and Daniel Webster and Charles Sumner and Henry Cabot Lodge and John Kennedy to the United States Senate, are entitled to representation in that body by men who inspire their utmost confidence. I would understand full well why some might think it right for me to resign. For me, this will be a difficult decision to make. It has been 7 years since my first election to the Senate. You and I share many memories. Some of them have been glorious, some have been very sad. The opportunity to work with you and serve Massachusetts has made my life worthwhile. And so I ask you tonight, the people of Massachusetts, to think this through with me. In facing this decision, I seek your advice and opinion. In making it, I seek your prayers, for this is a decision that I will have finally to make on my own. It has been written, a man does what he must in spite of personal consequences, in spite of obstacles and dangers and pressures. And that is the basis of all human morality. Whatever may be the sacrifices he faces, if he follows his conscience, the loss of his friends, his fortune, his contentment, even the esteem of his fellow man, each man must decide for himself the course he will follow. The stories of the past courage cannot supply courage itself. For this, each man must look into his own soul. I pray that I can have the courage to make the right decision. Whatever is decided, whatever the future holds for me, I hope that I shall be able to put this most recent tragedy behind me and make some further contribution to our state and mankind, whether it be in public or private life. Thank you and good night. All right, I know that was kind of long-winded. I didn't know if I wanted to include it or not, but I feel like this is a lesson in gaslighting bullshit 101, so I decided to include it in the episode. In January 1970, 6 months after the crash, an inquest was finally held in Edgartown. Not because local authorities were clamoring for answers, but because public pressure was mounting and the media was not letting this one go, thankfully. The inquest was conducted by Judge James A. Boyle and ran for several days behind closed doors. That's right, was not even public. The Kennedy team claimed that open proceedings would taint potential jurors. Translation: they wanted to get ahead of whatever was going to come out. Judge Boyle heard from 25 witnesses, including those who were at the party that night and several experts. The testimony from the diver who recovered Mary Jo's body was devastating. He said that she could have survived for up to an hour after the crash. And again, he said if he had been called immediately, he could have saved her. When Boyle issued his findings, they were scathing but vague. He wrote that Kennedy's conduct probably contributed to the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. Not that it did, not that it would have, just probably. He noted the delay in reporting the crash and Kennedy's decision to leave the scene, saying they were inexplicable if he wasn't trying to conceal something. But still, nothing came of it. No new charges, no grand jury, no criminal trial, just a 76-page report gathering dust while Kennedy went back to work on Capitol Hill like nothing had happened. This inquest has been made public. I read some pages of it, though it is several hundred pages long. You could find it on the Internet Archives if you are interested. And also, if you're interested, there are some documents related to this on the FBI site. There was a FOIA submission, and there's about 30 or 40 pages. It includes a portion of the inquest transcript, specifically Ted being questioned, if you're just interested in hearing what he had to say. What I thought was interesting is that there is a person who contacted the FBI, the name is redacted, and the last line of that first page talking about the incident says, quote, stated fact Senator Kennedy was driver is not being revealed to anyone, end quote. I suspect this is probably from when somebody reported the incident that's close to Kennedy before this was reported to Edgartown police. That's just my assumption. A lot of it's redacted, so it's unclear, but that's what my gut is telling me. I feel like the FBI, please don't arrest me, FBI, if you're listening. I feel like they've done a lot of covering up for politicians, but again, this is just my gut, so who knows? After all of that, after leaving a woman to die, avoiding the cops, and spinning a ghost story into a PR strategy, Ted Kennedy started slinking back into politics because of course he did. Accountability is not exactly a family value. By the time the 1970 election rolled around, the Kennedy machine had rebranded the whole thing. It wasn't a scandal anymore, it was a tragedy for Ted. Suddenly, he was the heartbroken one, still grieving, deeply remorseful, as if he was the one who spent his final minutes alone, trapped in a sinking car, knowing he's about to drown. He didn't bother to debate, he barely showed up to campaign. He gave a couple of interviews where the questions were very carefully screened, and the answers were even more carefully rehearsed. The whole campaign was basically, I messed up, but I'm a Kennedy. You get it. And the people did get it, or at least they let it go. In 1972, he was reelected with 62% of the vote. That's not a comeback. That is what happens when power outruns consequences, and that is something that we still see today. But Chappaquiddick didn't disappear. It followed him. It sat in every corner of every room he walked into. And when he finally made a run for the presidency in 1980, it was waiting. His campaign was a mess. Reporters, hell yeah reporters, kept bringing up the crash. Voters asked if they could trust him. During one interview, a journalist straight up asked, "Why do you want to be president?" And Kennedy choked. Couldn't answer. Gave some half-assed line about public service. But the silence said everything. You want to run the country, but you couldn't pick up a phone when it actually mattered. He lost to Jimmy Carter, and that was probably the closest he ever got to the White House. The Kennedy name might have opened the door, but Chappaquiddick slammed it shut. Still, he stayed in the Senate for decades. He reinvented himself as a liberal lion, healthcare, civil rights, education. He attached his name to it all, and yeah, he passed bills that I think a lot of us are grateful for. He gave speeches, he showed up, but none of that changes what happened that night, and none of that brings Mary Jo back. It just helped him rebuild the myth, one Senate vote at a time. By the time he died in 2009, he was the Lion of the Senate. The obits were glowing. They called him resilient, passionate, a statesman. Most gave Chappaquiddick a paragraph, maybe two. Mary Jo didn't get a second act. She didn't get a redemption arc. She got a sealed coffin and a legacy reduced to a Kennedy footnote. She was a campaign staffer, a brilliant speechwriter, a woman with a bright future until one powerful man decided his reputation was worth more than her life. Ted Kennedy didn't just lie, he walked away, and then he watched the system protect him while the world forgot about her. And people still talk about Chappaquiddick not because it was some political misstep, but because it's the moment the mask slipped, when it became clear that if your name is big enough and your story sad enough, you don't have to pay the price, you just have to survive the news cycle. If the content of this episode has sounded familiar to you, it should. Last episode, I covered Martha Moxley and how RFK Jr. launched a crusade to get his cousin Michael Skakel out of prison. Different case, same last name, same outcome, no accountability. The Kennedy dynasty running the same fucking playbook. Different decade, same bullshit. Ted Kennedy let a woman die in his car and still spent the next 4 decades playing the role of national statesman. He didn't just survive the scandal, he turned it into a career. And let's not forget that he was around when William Kennedy Smith brutally raped and attacked his victim. I couldn't tell you why Ted Kennedy didn't get canceled, but if there's anyone that was deserving of it, it was him. Instead, he got a fucking memorial service at the Capitol and a bridge named after him, which, in case the irony isn't slapping you in the face hard enough, was not the same bridge that he drove off of when he murdered Mary Jo. And meanwhile, the woman he left underwater in the dark got nothing. Mary Jo wasn't just collateral damage in somebody else's legacy. She was a brilliant political mind, a strategist, someone who believed in the process until that process buried her. And if Ted Kennedy had done the bare minimum, if he'd knocked on a door, called the police, admitted what happened, she might have lived. But instead, he protected himself and the world let him. And we're supposed to call that justice? Thanks for listening. Like, review, subscribe. You can find me on TikTok, fthatpod, Instagram, fthat_pod. There's a private Discord server as well. Website is fthatpod.com. Patreon for my full log of episodes, ad-free episodes, and early releases.